Good evening, and let's start with a simple question that used to have a simple answer. When a president announces a major international deal, what are you supposed to expect? Terms, documents, signatures, a timeline, something, anything that connects words to reality. Tonight, that expectation collapses, because what we are witnessing is not diplomacy as policy, but diplomacy as performance. Donald Trump has unveiled what he calls a breakthrough framework involving Greenland and the Arctic, and yet the closer you look, the more it seems to dissolve into thin air. No papers, no specifics, no binding commitments, just declarations of success, delivered with confidence and a demand that everyone applaud. This story begins with escalation. Trump publicly floated extreme ideas about Greenland, ideas that went far beyond traditional negotiations. He talked about acquisition, about force, about leverage through tariffs. Those comments triggered international outrage and immediate solidarity among U.S. allies. Denmark pushed back. Greenland's leadership pushed back. NATO partners closed ranks. The message from abroad was clear. This was not how allies talk to each other. And for a moment, it looked like Trump had backed himself into a corner of his own making, creating a crisis with no obvious off-ramp. Then came the reversal. While attending Davos, Trump announced that he had, in his words, reached a framework for a future deal concerning Greenland and the broader Arctic region. He claimed the arrangement would benefit the United States and NATO, and used this announcement to justify backing away from tariffs that were scheduled to take effect on February 1st. He even named a negotiation team, Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and a special envoy reporting directly to him. On the surface, this looked like de-escalation, like leadership, like resolution. But almost immediately, a critical question emerged. What exactly is this deal? That question is where the entire narrative begins to wobble. A framework, by definition, is supposed to frame something concrete. It outlines direction, scope, and intent. But in this case, the framework appeared to function less as a structure and more as a shield, something to stand behind while avoiding details. No terms were released, no conditions explained, no acknowledgement of sovereignty, ratification processes, or legal authority. Instead, the public was asked to accept what can only be described as deal vibes, the suggestion that success exists simply because it has been declared. This is not an isolated moment, it is a pattern. First, an extreme threat that dominates headlines and shocks allies. Second, the predictable backlash and consequences. Third, a sudden announcement that the crisis has been solved, without evidence, without documentation, and without accountability. The promise is always pushed into the future, safely out of reach of verification, and the expectation is always the same. Move on, stop asking questions, trust the performance. In this case, Trump wanted the world to believe that an international confrontation over sovereignty and security had been neutralized by a deal that no one could actually describe. And that brings us to the moment that turns confusion into something more troubling. When pressed about whether this arrangement involved U.S. ownership of Greenland, the very idea that sparked outrage in the first place, Trump did not clarify. He rebranded. He called it a long-term deal. Then he called it the ultimate long-term deal. And finally, he used a word that stops scrutiny cold: infinite. An infinite deal, forever. No end date, no explanation, no signatures. Just a claim so vague and absolute that it seems designed to shut down debate rather than invite it. Because once a president starts talking about infinite international agreements without documents, terms, or consent from the people involved, we are no longer discussing normal politics. We are watching something else entirely. And in part 2, we're going to break down why this kind of language isn't just absurd. It's dangerous, how it reshapes incentives for allies, and why the fallout from this infinite deal may be only just beginning. To understand why the word infinite matters so much here, you have to understand what diplomacy actually runs on. International agreements are built on limits, timeframes, conditions, ratification processes, enforcement mechanisms. They are finite by design because democracies require accountability. When Trump responded to direct questions about terms, duration, and ownership by calling this an infinite deal, he wasn't just dodging details. He was stepping outside the language of governance altogether. Infinite is not a clause. It's not a category recognized by Congress, NATO, Denmark, or Greenland. It's a rhetorical escape hatch, a way to appear decisive while providing nothing that can be challenged, debated, or approved. And that's what makes this episode more than just sloppy messaging. When reporters pressed for clarification, ownership, timelines, legal authority, there was nothing underneath the confidence. No treaty process, no vote in Greenland, no parliamentary approval in Denmark, no congressional oversight in the United States. Those absences matter because Greenland is not a blank space on a map. It is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, and any shift in sovereignty would require explicit consent and complex legal steps. None of that exists here. What exists is a claim of success without substance, delivered as though repetition itself could turn imagination into reality. This is where the media ecosystem around Trump becomes part of the story. Supportive outlets had spent weeks amplifying his earlier rhetoric. Talk of acquiring Greenland, even taking it by force. Then, almost overnight, they were forced to pivot. Suddenly, the same voices that treated those threats as bold strategy were trying to decode what an infinite deal might mean. Former diplomats were brought on air to speculate in real time, openly admitting they didn't know what had been agreed to, if anything. That moment matters because it exposes the machinery, statement first, meaning later. The goal isn't clarity, it's maintaining the appearance of control, even when control is absent. The confusion didn't stop there. During remarks connected to this episode, Trump reportedly mixed up Greenland and Iceland multiple times. When the mistake was noticed, the attempted cleanup only deepened the problem, reducing Greenland to a piece of ice rather than a place with people, governance, and sovereignty. That might sound trivial, but in international politics, signals matter. Allies listen closely to how they are described. When a U.S. president treats strategic partners as props or punchlines, it sends a message that respect is optional, and once respect erodes, trust follows. This is especially dangerous because the stakes around Greenland are real and growing. The Arctic is becoming more strategically important as climate conditions shift and competition over shipping routes, military positioning, early warning systems, and critical minerals intensifies. Greenland's location plays a role in NATO defense planning, surveillance, and supply chains. Serious leaders approach that reality through cooperation, investment, shared security agreements, scientific collaboration, and respect for sovereignty. Trump approaches it through ownership language, as if collective defense were a real estate transaction. That worldview cannot coexist easily with alliances built on mutual obligation. And here's where the rising action becomes unavoidable. When allies hear threats instead of partnership, they don't wait around to see if the next announcement will be real. They plan. They coordinate without you. They invest elsewhere. The reference material makes this clear. Leaders abroad are already signaling readiness to defend sovereignty, to strengthen Arctic defense independently, and to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Even if Trump now claims the crisis is resolved, the damage isn't erased. Memory in diplomacy becomes posture. Posture becomes policy. And policy reshapes the world long after the press conference is over. So by the time Trump declares victory with an infinite deal, the consequences are already in motion. The question is no longer whether this framework exists, it's what happens when a president governs through spectacle instead of substance. And in part 3, we're going to look at how that spectacle translates into real costs for U.S. credibility, for global stability, and for Americans who live with the fallout long after the applause fades. By the time this story reaches its breaking point, the absurdity is no longer the most important feature. The danger is. When a president repeatedly substitutes performance for policy, the world doesn't just laugh, it recalculates. The reference material makes a stark argument. Stability itself is a national asset. You won't find it listed on a balance sheet, but when it disappears, the effects show up everywhere. Markets, investment decisions, alliances, borrowing costs, and security planning. Trump's Greenland episode accelerates that erosion because it signals that U.S. commitments may hinge on ego, impulse, or leverage rather than law and continuity. This is where the infinite deal stops being a punchline and becomes a warning sign. Infinite agreements without terms are impossible to scrutinize. They can't be ratified, enforced, or even clearly explained. And that is precisely why they are useful as political theater. They bypass the normal democratic checkpoints, Congress, allied governments, public debate, and replace them with a narrative of personal triumph. According to the material you provided, this isn't an accident. It's a pattern. A crisis is created through reckless rhetoric. Consequences emerge. Then a theatrical reversal is announced, framed as genius, even though it amounts to undoing the original threat. The media feedback loop intensifies the effect. Supportive networks pivot from amplifying the threat to celebrating the supposed resolution, sometimes within the same news cycle. Viewers are told the stock market is responding positively, that confidence has been restored, that strength has been demonstrated. Meanwhile, the underlying reality remains unchanged. There is no treaty, no agreement, no shift in legal status. What has changed is perception, carefully managed to protect the image of competence. And that gap between image and substance is where democratic accountability weakens. The transcript also highlights a moment that reveals just how degraded the standards have become. Trump reportedly referenced NATO leaders calling him daddy, a detail so bizarre it almost defies analysis. But its inclusion matters because it illustrates normalization. In another political era, such language would trigger alarm. Now, it is shrugged off as style, as entertainment. Governor Gavin Newsom's point, as quoted in the reference, cuts through the noise. Trump is graded on a curve. Behavior that would end any other presidency is treated as background static. And that normalization is not harmless. It lowers the barrier for the next escalation. Because once incoherence is accepted as strength, anything can be justified. Threats become leverage. Contradictions become strategy. The absence of facts becomes boldness. In this case, the lack of a real agreement is reframed as visionary leadership. But allies don't operate on vibes. They operate on memory and incentives. When they hear extortion, pay up, comply, or face tariffs, they plan alternatives. They deepen regional partnerships. They reduce dependence. Over time, those adjustments solidify into structures that exclude the United States, not out of spite, but out of necessity. And while all of this plays out on the global stage, there is a domestic contrast that sharpens the climax. Americans are not living in an infinite economy. They are dealing with real costs: housing, healthcare, groceries, interest rates, job insecurity. The reference material draws a sharp moral line here. While Trump performs imperial theater with imaginary frameworks, the public absorbs the consequences of instability. Market swings, diplomatic isolation, and weakened credibility do not stay overseas. They filter down into everyday life. This is the moment where the story stops being about Greenland alone. It becomes about governance itself. If a president can threaten the sovereignty of an ally, retreat without admitting error, and declare victory through an imaginary contract, what stops the cycle from repeating? What happens the next time distraction is needed? The next time markets wobble? The next time outrage must be redirected? These are not abstract questions. They are the stakes. And in part 4, we'll bring this full circle. What this episode teaches us, what it signals going forward, and why refusing to normalize it may be the most important takeaway of all. When you strip away the bravado, the tweets, and the grand declarations, what's left of the Greenland episode is not strength but spectacle. It is bully behavior followed by face-saving theater. A threat that generated international outrage followed by an imaginary resolution designed to make the threat disappear without accountability. Trump did not negotiate a landmark agreement. He backed away from his own escalation and tried to rebrand the retreat as triumph. That is not the art of the deal, it is the art of the con. The reference material summarizes this pattern with brutal clarity. A reckless decision creates a problem, the problem produces consequences, and then followers are told the issue has been magically solved, often by reversing the original decision while claiming credit for brilliance. In this case, the so-called infinite deal serves one purpose: to cut the fuse without admitting the bomb was ever real. But diplomacy does not work that way. Allies remember threats. Governments remember humiliation. Institutions remember instability. Even if the White House wants to move on, the world does not reset. That memory has consequences. Denmark and Greenland will not forget a U.S. president threatening their sovereignty. NATO leaders will not forget being treated like subordinates or extorted with tariffs. Other democracies will not forget watching American policy swing wildly based on impulse. Memory hardens into posture. Posture becomes defense spending. Defense spending reshapes alliances. Alliances shift power. And slowly, almost invisibly, American influence shrinks. Not because the country is weak, but because its leadership appears unreliable. This is why normalization is the real danger. Laughing at the absurdity of an infinite deal is easy. Accepting it as normal is catastrophic. When incoherence is treated as style and threats are excused as tactics, the guardrails of democratic governance erode. What should trigger alarm becomes entertainment. What should demand accountability becomes background noise. And every time that happens, the next escalation becomes easier, not harder. The final contrast is the one that matters most. While Trump performs deal theater on the world stage, Americans are living in the real economy. They are not dealing in frameworks or vibes. They are dealing with rent, mortgages, healthcare costs, groceries, and job security. Stability is not abstract to them. It affects whether investments happen, whether prices rise, and whether the country is seen as a reliable partner. When leadership treats global politics like a personality cult, the public pays the price. So here is the bottom line. The Greenland episode is not a one-off gaffe. It is a case study in how governance by spectacle undermines credibility at home and abroad. It shows how fake frameworks can be used to cover real damage, and it raises the question we cannot afford to ignore. If an imaginary deal can erase a manufactured crisis today, what will be invented tomorrow? If you found this helpful, comment your thoughts below, hit like, and subscribe to our channel. Don't miss the next update.